On an evening in September of 2017, a woman living in Massachusetts came home from work to an empty house. Her boyfriend was gone, but she saw that his wallet and his phone were still right there on the counter, and also on the kitchen table were 3 fairly conspicuous envelopes. Confused, she walked over to the envelopes and she began to open them. One of them was her boyfriend's last will and testament. Another was a note that was for her. And the third was a letter that was addressed to the family of a woman who had been murdered 25 years earlier. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of April 15th, 1992, a 24-year-old woman named Lisa Ziegert drove through the quiet suburban streets of Agawam, Massachusetts. And eventually, she pulled into a shopping plaza in the center of town, which was full of shops and restaurants and bars. So Lisa was a teacher's aide at the local middle school, and while teaching was definitely her passion, the reality was being a teacher's aide did not pay very well. So to earn some extra money, she also worked the evening shift at a store called Brittany's Card and Gift Shop, which sold things like birthday cards and stuffed animals and music boxes. As she drove through the lot looking for a parking space, she passed by a chicken restaurant where her friend Ed Borgatti worked. So Ed shared a house with Lisa's boyfriend, Blair Masoya, as well as Lisa's sister, Lynn. So the 4 of them were all pretty close. And so as Lisa found her spot and parked her car and got out, she thought about popping into the restaurant to say hi to Ed, who was also working that day. But when she checked her time, she thought better of it, and instead she just walked straight to the gift store to start her shift. A few hours later, around 7 p.m., Lisa sat behind the counter at the gift store, humming along to the song that was playing on the overhead speakers. Lisa was the only employee on duty during the evening shifts, and she was there until the store closed at 9 p.m. And working alone so late at night definitely made her a little bit anxious. And, she did every now and again have issues with problem customers. And so she was just always kind of a bit on edge, especially considering, some rowdy people often came out of the pool hall that was just a few doors down, and they sometimes came in the shop and were just kind of a handful. And on top of all that, there was something else going on that Lisa actually couldn't quite explain. Lately, she'd been having this weird feeling that somebody was watching her through the windows of the store. So, as Lisa is sitting behind the counter, feeling, very anxious and sort of stressed about the night, she hears the sound of the door to the shop opening. There was a bell above the door that jingled every time the door opened. And so she whipped around to see who it was, and she was very relieved to see that it was actually just her older sister Lynn, not some random customer who might be a problem. Lisa was really close with Lynn, and sometimes her sister would just stop by to chat and keep Lisa company, especially during her evening shifts. So Lynn walked in and asked Lisa how things were going, and Lisa said it was fine, and then eventually she sort of shifted the conversation to how, Lisa was still sort of upset that she had not been able to land a full-time teaching job yet. She told Lynn that what she really wanted here was just, a teaching job that paid better than what she had now so that she could quit this gift store job. Not only because this late night shift really creeped her out, but also because she'd be able to spend more time with her boyfriend Blair if she just had this full-time teaching job instead of splitting these 2 jobs. And so the 2 sisters continued to chat for about a half an hour, and then Lisa walked Lynn to the door and waved goodbye. And as Lisa watched her sister drive away in her car, Lisa suddenly became aware of the fact that the parking lot of this plaza was really full tonight. And there were lines of cars, of people honking at each other, trying to get, the few remaining spots. And as Lisa stood there in the gift shop's doorway, she looked over and saw that the owner of the carpet shop next door, James Dent, was closing up. And James, he looked over, saw Lisa, and he made a comment about how crazy the parking lot was tonight. And Lisa was like, yeah, it gets pretty busy at night, but this is even, crazier than usual. After that, the 2 said goodbye and they went their separate ways. And Lisa, she turned right around and went back inside the gift store. About an hour later, around 8:20 p.m., Lisa rang up a customer at the counter. She handed the customer his change and his receipt and told him to have a good night. And then once he was gone, she went into the back room to take inventory before closing. After such a long and stressful day, Lisa was really glad that her shift was nearly over. In about 40 minutes, she was going to close up the shop and then maybe walk over to see if Ed was still working at the restaurant, chat with him for a bit, and then head home. But just then, Lisa heard the sound of that bell on the door, which meant somebody was coming in. So she stepped out of the back to see who it was. The next morning, so April 16th, 1992, Detective Wayne Macy of the Agawam Police Department stepped into Brittany's card and gift shop. When he got in there, he saw that there were already officers from his department putting up crime scene tape and taking photos of the scene. One of the officers came over to Macy to fill him in, and they explained that that morning, one of the employees from this gift shop had called 911. And what she said is she got to work that morning to start her shift at the gift shop, and right away when she arrived, she noticed something odd. She saw one of her coworkers, Lisa Ziegert, who normally worked the night shift and closed the shop down. She saw her car was out in the parking lot. And so that was odd because she shouldn't be here. She works at night. And then this woman who ultimately called 911, her name is Sophia, she went up to the storefront and found the door was unlocked. And also when she stepped inside, all the lights were on and the overhead speakers were still playing. And so, Sophia's thinking, that's odd. Like, is Lisa working this morning or something? But she searched the whole store and Lisa was nowhere to be found, even though all her belongings were still in the store. And so ultimately, she called the police. The officer also told Macy that they had already spoken to the man who owned the shop right next door, the carpet shop. And the owner of that store said he had actually spoken to Lisa the night before around maybe 7:30 p.m. And at the time, she was acting totally normal, seemed very happy. They were just talking about, how hectic the parking lot was that night. Detective Macy asked the officer if anyone had been in touch with any of Lisa's family or friends to see if anybody had heard from her or seen her. And the officer said that they had been in touch with those people and that no one had seen or heard from her since last night. Additionally, the officer said that Lisa's roommate had said Lisa never came home. And she also had not shown up to her other job at the middle school that morning where she was a teacher's aide. At this point, the officer told Macy that, hey, you just got to come in the back of the store because what we found in there make it really obvious that what we're dealing with here is foul play. So Macy said, all right, lead the way. And he followed this officer into the back room of the shop. And as soon as he looked inside, his heart sank. There were all these cardboard boxes in the back room that had been sort of flattened, like one or maybe multiple people were laying on all these boxes, and there was blood all over the boxes. And so based on this, it seemed pretty apparent to Macy and the other officers that, if Lisa is not here right now, but her things are here, her car is here, like she didn't disappear voluntarily. Like all the initial evidence suggests that she was taken away by force. As Macy was walking around the small back room, he noticed there was actually a back door that had been left partially open that no officers had touched. So this is how it was left. And he walked over and he opened this door and he saw this door led to this narrow back alley that ran behind the building. Also, as Macy was looking at this back door, he looked down and he saw what appeared to be, pretty obvious scuff marks across the ground, as if maybe somebody had been dragged and their shoes had sort of scuffed the ground on the way out. And so Macy stepped into this back alleyway to see if there was any nearby security cameras that could have potentially captured whatever happened back here the night before, but he didn't see any. So he left the alley and he went to the front and he began going to the other stores in this plaza to see if any of them had cameras that potentially faced like the front of the shop. But Macy was very disappointed to learn that none of these shops had security cameras. So there was going to be no footage of whatever happened here. And so at this point, Macy knew this was going to be a really challenging case to solve. Because he had no eyewitnesses, at least not right now, and no security camera footage, it meant there was no clear, easy way to try to figure out what the assailant looked like, or, what their car could have looked like, or even what direction they might have gone. Like, he had nothing. And so Macy went right to his car, he grabbed his radio, and he called dispatch, and he told them to right now send out search teams, police dogs, and scour every inch of this area for any sign of Lisa. After that, Macy went back inside the shop to check the cash register. He figured if this was a robbery, that very likely the money would be missing. But when he got in there and he opened it up, the cash was still inside. But Macy knew that violent attacks by random strangers was pretty rare. More often than not, people who get killed or people who get kidnapped, their perpetrator or perpetrators are people they know. At some point, Macy pressed a few buttons on the cash register, and it began to spit out this paper log of all the most recent transactions. And Macy saw that the last purchase, at least as reflected on this register, was made with cash at 8:20 p.m. the night before. And for the first time, Macy actually felt a surge of optimism about this case, because this was a very helpful clue. Since the gift store closed at 9 p.m., this narrowed down the time window significantly. It meant the attack likely happened in the 40 minutes between that transaction at 8:20 and closing at 9 p.m., a time when very few of the other businesses in the plaza were open, except for the restaurants and pool hall. That afternoon, Detective Macy knocked on the door of Lisa's parents' house. The search at the shopping plaza was now fully underway, and a team of officers was already searching Lisa's apartment across town for clues. And in the meantime, Macy wanted to speak to Lisa's family and see if they knew anything. When Lisa's mother opened the door, she looked frantic, but she also seemed relieved that a police officer was finally there to fill her in on what was happening. And so she told Macy to come in, and Macy stepped into a house that was absolutely buzzing with activity. As the detective entered the dining room, he saw that at least a dozen people, most of them around Lisa's age, were gathered around the table. They had this big map spread out on the table and were talking about maybe organizing their own search effort. And then when they saw Detective Macy, they all sort of flocked around him and began peppering him with questions about what happened to Lisa, where is she? Macy told the group, which consisted mainly of friends and some family, that he would speak to all of them one by one, but in an orderly fashion. And he would start with Lisa's mother. The group seemed to understand this and kind of naturally throttled back. And then at that point, Macy took Lisa's mother, they went into the living room, and they sat down to talk. The first question he asked her was, do you know of anybody out there who might have wanted to harm your daughter? And Lisa's mother immediately said, no way. Lisa did not have any enemies. She was quite friendly, very hardworking, and really just stayed out of trouble. And for the rest of this interview, which lasted, another 30 minutes or so, that really was the sentiment that Lisa's mother communicated, that this was totally unheard of, that anything would happen to Lisa. She never did anything wrong. She had no problems. She had no enemies. I don't know what happened. And so Macy, after speaking to the mother, would also speak to Lisa's father, her two sisters, and her roommate. And then also he would speak to her boyfriend Blair and Blair's roommate, Ed Borgatti. Blair seemed really broken up about his girlfriend's disappearance. When Macy asked where he had been the night before, Blair said he was at his mother's home for most of the night, except for a quick trip to CVS. He said he didn't remember the exact time he went there, but he definitely had the receipt back at home. And when Macy spoke to Ed, so Blair's roommate, Ed also seemed really upset about what happened to Lisa. He told Macy that he and Lisa were definitely good friends and they worked near each other in that shopping plaza. And he said he'd actually been working at the chicken restaurant around the same time of Lisa's disappearance. Again, most violent attacks are not committed by strangers. They're committed by people who know their victims. And here was a potential suspect who not only, knew Lisa very well, but was also just a few hundred feet away when she was attacked and potentially abducted. It just seemed almost too obvious. So Macy made a note to be sure to look into Ed very thoroughly and see if any of Lisa's friends knew about maybe any tension between those two. However, as Macy would go around and question all of Lisa's friends who were at the house, none of them had anything negative to say about Ed or Blair. and none of them knew anything useful about Lisa's disappearance. However, one of Lisa's friends did say that about a week earlier, Lisa had told her about this feeling she had of being watched while she was at the store. But Lisa hadn't actually said anything about why she felt that way or who she thought was watching her. So even though it was an interesting lead, Macy knew it would be virtually impossible to actually follow up on. And at this point, he was just getting a little frustrated, because not only did he have no eyewitness or security footage of Lisa's abduction, it seemed absolutely no one even had a motive to harm Lisa. In fact, the only useful piece of information he got from all the interviews was from Lisa's sister, Lynn, who said she had stopped by the store about an hour or two before Lisa disappeared. She was able to give Macy a very detailed description of what Lisa was wearing: a denim skirt, boots, and a charm bracelet. And so by the time Macy was leaving the home, he felt really disappointed by how little he had uncovered. He just hoped that the officers in charge of the search effort were maybe having more luck. 3 days later, on the afternoon of Sunday, April 19th, Detective Macy parked at the edge of the woods off Route 75, less than a mile from the gift store. Seconds later, another police cruiser pulled up right behind him. So earlier that afternoon, a man had been out walking his dog in these woods, and he had unfortunately come across a dead body and had called it in. And so Macy, when he heard this, had driven straight over here, thinking this could be Lisa's body. And now, as he got out of his cruiser, he saw there were tire tracks that the man who had called in the body had said he had also seen. He said there were tracks near the body, and so Macy's thinking, okay, I gotta follow these tracks and it will likely bring me to this body. And so Macy, along with 3 other officers, began following these tracks into the trees. But Macy, who was at the front of this group, only took a few steps before his feet literally sank down into the mud to the point where it was up to his ankles. This area would turn out to be extremely swampy, to the point where the officers actually had to walk in each other's footprints in a single file line just to try to navigate this mud. And so into the woods they went, carefully walking in this straight line until the tire tracks began to fade. At this point, Macy and the others looked around and, there was no body where they were, and there was no sign of any body or anything unusual. But the man who had found the body had said these tracks sort of aimed in the direction of where the body was found. And so Macy and the others just continued in that single file line, sort of just trudging directly into the woods for hours, until finally they did reach this small out-of-the-way clearing. And in the clearing, Macy and the others saw clothing items scattered all over the place. At this point, it was starting to get dark, and so Macy pulled out his flashlight and he shined it around in this clearing. And at some point, his beam of light landed on a woman's body lying right next to a tree. She was partially naked, and some of her clothes that she still had on had been pulled down. So it seemed fairly obvious that she had been sexually assaulted before she died. Also, there were clearly multiple stab wounds all over her body, including one to her throat. And then when Macy crouched down next to her to get a better look, his flashlight reflected off of a charm bracelet on her wrist. Less than an hour later, Detective Macy had to shield his eyes as a floodlight clicked on and threw blinding light all over this clearing he was in. A forensics team had just arrived and fired up their generators so they could work through the night with lights. And also overhead, a helicopter now circled the woods, taking aerial photos of the scene. These woods, at least from Macy's perspective, were such a maze that it seemed very likely that the killer must be a local who knew this area well. And also, if they'd driven through all that mud, Macy figured that whoever they were looking for likely was driving a vehicle with four-wheel drive, like a truck or a Jeep. So he told the forensics team to make a cast of the tire tracks that were left behind near the edge of the road to see if there was anything else they could find out about the vehicle. And then Macy also quietly was sort of crossing his fingers that this forensics team would also be able to hopefully find a trace of the killer's DNA on Lisa's body. A few days later, Macy was sitting at his desk at the police station. The phones in the bullpen were ringing more than usual that day, But Macy was doing his best to shut the noise out and just focus on the reports that were on his desk. The forensics team had found DNA on Lisa's body, and so now Macy had to make a list of all the potential suspects that he would need to collect DNA samples from to see if any of them were a match to the DNA found on Lisa's body. Lisa's boyfriend, Blair, seemed like an obvious suspect, even though none of Lisa's friends or family had known about any problems in their relationship. Blair also had handed over that receipt from CVS that confirmed he was there around the same time that Lisa was abducted. But it would have only taken about, maybe 3 minutes to drive from the CVS to the gift store. So it seemed, completely possible to Macy that, Blair could have attacked Lisa while he was out and just also grabbed the CVS receipt to sort of build an alibi, but a shaky one. Another strong suspect was actually Blair's roommate, Ed. His alibi was that he'd been working at a restaurant right next to the gift store when Lisa was kidnapped, which just seemed way too convenient. And so Macy thought, it was entirely possible that Ed, during his shift, could have snuck over to the shop, maybe killed Lisa right there in the store and then left her there. And then, after his shift was over, because he knows no one's going to be back in that gift shop, he could have gone back over, grabbed the body, disposed of her in the woods, and nobody knows. And on top of that, Ed just so happened to own a Jeep. So now Macy clearly needed to get DNA samples from both Blair and Ed, and also Macy planned to analyze the tires of both of their vehicles to see if either of them matched the tracks from the woods. Suddenly, though, the constant ringing of the bullpen phones just became too much for Macy to ignore. And so he stood up from his work, sort of annoyed, and he walked over to see, what was going on. Why are there so many calls happening right now? And one of the officers that was out there said all these calls were for the Lisa Ziegert tip line. Macy was sort of surprised to hear that. He knew the tip line had been set up, but for the past few days, there really hadn't been many calls. But the officer told Macy that, the floodlights in the forest and the helicopters flying over the woods the night before had really caught the attention of the local news. And as soon as word got out that, Lisa's body had been found out there, almost everyone in Agawam seemed to have a theory about what had happened, and now they were calling in their theory. But he said that these tips were sort of all over the map, and there were already dozens of different descriptions of suspicious vehicles or suspicious people that, could be suspects. Macy told the officer to, keep doing his job and to make sure you log all the tips that come in, and that Macy and his team would look through them one by one when they had a chance. And as Macy turned and walked back towards his office and he continued to hear all these phones ringing, he realized his team might have to do a whole lot more DNA comparisons than he'd originally planned on. Because this was the early 90s, there was no way to have one DNA sample like you would find on a body, let's say, and then just put it into a bank and see what turns up. That didn't exist. And so what he's saying is he needs to compare this sample directly to basically all these potential people and hope one of them lines up. 1 full year later, on a morning in 1993, Detective Macy dug through a cardboard box full of police reports and interview notes. There were dozens of boxes just like this one stacked all over his office, and they were all full of files on the Lisa Ziegert investigation. Macy and his team of detectives had spent the entire past year basically working around the clock on this case, digging into one lead after another, and it had been exhausting. Since Agawam was such a small town, Lisa's murder was all anyone could talk about, and the detectives had received hundreds of tips on Lisa's case. The police station even had to install extra phones to handle all the calls. And no matter how far-fetched the tips seemed, Macy's team looked into each and every one. For example, there was a woman who worked at the all-female gym that Lisa used to go to who had called in and said there was this man who showed up at their gym every day at 3 p.m. and he would buy frozen yogurt from the juice bar. But while he ate the yogurt, he would just stand there and eat it, sort of staring out at all the women. And to this woman, this employee, she felt like he could be the killer. Another tipster had called in and said they actually had seen a police car parked right near the gift store around the time Lisa was abducted. And when Macy heard this, he ordered a DNA test from every single officer in the department, but none matched. There was also another wild theory that Lisa's boyfriend, Blair, apparently had a secret romance with his roommate, Ed. And Ed had apparently killed Lisa because Lisa found out about it. Somebody else had called in and said that their friend had borrowed their car on the day Lisa was killed, and when they returned the car, apparently there were bloodstains in it. So they were basically saying, look into my friend. And then also, there were all these women who called in basically saying their husbands did it. Whether or not there was merit there, wasn't clear, but lots of husbands were getting accused. There were also dozens of tips that were just too vague to do anything with, like people saying that they saw a man in a dark coat or a guy at a bar who looked suspicious. And so at the end of the first year of this investigation, Detective Macy had looked into 400 people of interest, but none of those leads went anywhere. To Macy's disappointment, Blair and Ed, who were really the two most obvious suspects, were actually ruled out very quickly. Their tires from their vehicles ultimately didn't match the tracks found in the woods, and they'd both given DNA samples, which did not match the DNA found on Lisa's body. And it was hard to get samples from all, the rest of the 400 other suspects, especially because in 1993, you needed a pretty significant amount of DNA to run a test. So the police typically made suspects come in and get their blood drawn. And a lot of the suspects just said no to that because they just didn't want to go through the hassle. And since most of the tips that had led to these people of interest were pretty flimsy, Macy didn't have probable cause to get a warrant to force them to do the blood draw. But of the hundreds of suspects who did give their DNA, none matched the DNA found on Lisa's body. And again, there's no bank to just run the sample through to see who else it could be. Like if you don't have somebody to compare it to, you couldn't do it in the early 90s. So, as Macy stood there looking at all those boxes of files that he'd spent months poring over, he had the sinking feeling that maybe the answer was not in there after all. At this point, it was like every tip he had gotten had led him down like an entirely different path than he was on, and he was just more lost and confused than ever. And so he felt like if he was going to actually find Lisa's killer, he needed new evidence or he needed an eyewitness to help point him in the right direction. And so as daunting as it was for Macy to think of this, he knew what he really needed now was actually even more tips. 6 months later, in the fall of 1993, so now we are about a year and a half after Lisa Ziegert's murder, Detective Macy stood in the corner of a massive call center in Burbank, California. All around him, dozens of workers sat in cubicles with computers and headsets. And Macy waited with nervous anticipation as one by one, their phones began to ring. Macy knew that the very popular TV show, Unsolved Mysteries, which told real stories of unsolved cold cases, was actually airing a segment about Lisa's murder at that very moment. But he wasn't actually watching the show. Instead, he was in the studio's call center to monitor the tip line, in case any viewers at home called in with valuable information on Lisa's case. And sure enough, within a few minutes, every single phone in the call center was ringing off the hook. Macy began to walk around the room and peek over the shoulders of the workers as they took notes on these calls that were coming in. And Macy admittedly was frustrated by what he was seeing. Most of the callers were just repeating this old rumor that Ed Borgatti was the killer, and that more than that, the police knew about it and were covering it up. So the reason for that is Ed actually had been ruled out by DNA evidence pretty early on in the investigation, but the police had decided not to announce that publicly until the case was closed. So the locals came up with a conspiracy theory to explain why Ed, who looked so suspicious from the outside, had never been arrested, that somehow the police were covering it up. Macy had hoped that by having this case be on Unsolved Mysteries, that it would lead to a fresh tip from a credible witness who maybe hadn't come forward yet, But instead, all he was getting was just more rumor and more speculation. In the end, the show generated 212 tips, and none of them led anywhere. And so as the years went on and still no new information came in, Lisa's case just continued to get colder and colder. By the time Detective Macy actually retired in 2003, it had been 11 years since her murder. Yet still, the murder was unsolved. Almost 23 years later, in January of 2015, Anthony Gallooni, the newly elected district attorney, walked down the hallway at the Agawam Police Headquarters. He found the door he was looking for, and he knocked. And a few seconds later, a detective named Mark Fow opened the door. Gallooni introduced himself and then asked to see all the files on the Lisa Ziegert investigation. Gallooni told the detective that he had grown up near Agawam, and he vividly remembered watching the news coverage of Lisa's murder when he was just 12 years old. And now that he was the DA, solving the cold case was one of his top priorities. Forensic technology had advanced a lot since the early 90s when this case was in its full swing. So Gallooni suggested they just send the DNA sample from Lisa's killer to the lab for phenotyping, which is basically using DNA markers to figure out what a person could look like. So this is not the same thing as putting the DNA into a huge bank and getting an exact match back. It's sort of like building a profile of who this belongs to. And so the DA was very confident that through this process, if they could build a really accurate physical profile of the suspect and cross-reference it against the hundreds of names they had collected over the years in this case, maybe they could finally close in on Lisa's killer. It would take over a year and a half for this process to be completed, but in September of 2016, DA Gallooni held a press conference to announce the results of the phenotyping. And so, during this press conference, a composite sketch of the killer appeared on the screen behind the DA. And all it showed was a Caucasian man with dark hair and either brown or hazel eyes, which does seem like not a whole lot of new information. But remember, this is sort of like definitely this person looks this way. This is not like we think he looks this way. This is what he looks like. And even though none of the investigators on the case actually recognized the face in the sketch, Gallooni hoped that somebody in the public, from this press release, would recognize him. So after the press conference, Gallooni went back to the police station, and with the help of a state trooper, they began sorting through the massive cabinets full of files on Lisa's case. They put together a list of every person of interest who had previously refused to give a DNA sample, and they were able to narrow it down to 11 suspects who fit the phenotype profile who didn't give their DNA sample. At that point, Gallooni pulled together all the evidence that he had against those 11 people, and he used it to secure warrants, forcing each of them to actually give their DNA. But before those DNA results even came back, Gallooni got a very unexpected phone call. And as he listened to the voice on the other end, his heart began to pound because he knew after, 2.5 decades here, he finally knew exactly who had killed Lisa Ziegert. Based on a written confession and DNA evidence, this is what police believe happened to Lisa Ziegert on April 15th, 1992. Around 8:30 p.m., the killer parked in the alley behind Brittany's card and gift shop. Then they walked around to the front of the store and hid behind a car and stared in the window and just watched Lisa. The killer had always been fascinated by abduction and bondage ever since they were young. And they had done their best to try to, keep those fantasies inside and not act on them. But when they had met Lisa, it was like their urges became just too powerful to control. So, on this night, when they saw Lisa disappear into the store's back room, the killer, steeled themselves, then took a deep breath, and stormed into the shop, just as they had imagined doing for so long. They had thought about this and fantasized about what this would be like, and now it was actually happening. And so they ambushed Lisa with a knife right as she was walking out of that back room, and they kind of grabbed her and wrapped their arm around her neck, and they sort of stumbled into the back room, and Lisa, she began fighting back. And so they're struggling, and they knocked over that huge pile of cardboard boxes, and at some point, Lisa tried to wrestle the knife out of the killer's grip. But after this intense struggle, the killer gained the upper hand and dragged her out the back door and into the alley. They shoved her into their vehicle and then drove a mile down the road and turned onto a dirt path that led into the woods. And then after they drove for a while, they reached a secluded spot in the forest, at which point they stopped, they pulled Lisa out of the back of the car, they threw her to the ground, and then they sexually assaulted her. And then after they were done, they stabbed her to death. And then they just left her, and they got back in their vehicle, and they drove away. By the time the killer got back to their own home, they were still buzzing with adrenaline. I mean, this was every bit as incredible as they thought it would be. However, when they actually walked into their house, and they heard a familiar female voice calling out from the other room, asking where they'd been, the killer looked down and suddenly realized there were cuts all over their hands. But at this point, it was too late to do anything about these cuts. Like, if they left to go clean up, they would just seem really suspicious to the woman in the next room. So the killer just took a deep breath and continued into their own house, hoping, she wouldn't notice the cuts and piece together the awful truth. The killer's name was Gary Shera, and he was a young man whose only connection to Lisa was that he had been a customer at the gift store where she worked. And so, the police had sort of begun the investigation with this idea that this really couldn't have been a random attack of sorts. But in reality, it sort of was. Police believe that just a few weeks before the murder, Shera had visited the shop just to buy a music box for his wife. Like, that actually was the reason he was going. It was not to just scout for a victim. He just went into the store to buy this gift. But when he saw Lisa working there, he sort of immediately became obsessed with her. And then that obsession ultimately turned into murder. In January of 1993, Shera's wife, who was the woman in the other room who called out to him asking where he had been on the night of Lisa's murder, she, the wife, ultimately called in a tip suggesting that her husband might have been involved in this murder. But the police decided the tip was not credible because Shera's wife was, one, an alcoholic, and two, Shera and his wife were in the middle of this heated divorce. And so it seemed like this could be revenge. And then also remember, there were all these other women calling in, basically suggesting their husband was the killer. So this is like one of many, and they had to filter some of them out. This one got filtered out. So ultimately, Shera's name sort of got buried amid the hundreds of other suspects until 25 years later, when police served him a warrant for a DNA sample. He was one of those 11 people who fit the phenotype who had not given a sample. And realizing he was about to get caught, he left his girlfriend a letter confessing to the murder and actually tried to end his own life, but he survived. Following his failed attempt to take his own life, Gary Shera was tracked down at the hospital and arrested on September 16, 2017. 2 years later, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. One night in October of 2001, a young woman named Amy and her friend, whose name was Eric, were at a dance club in Portland, Maine. Amy was having a blast, but Eric wasn't. He seemed bored and maybe a bit annoyed. Amy tried to convince him to come out on the dance floor and dance with her and have some fun and lighten up, but Eric said he wasn't interested. So Amy, determined not to let this ruin her night, she wandered over to the dance floor by herself. And Eric would watch her for a few minutes from a distance, and then he would leave to go use the bathroom. However, when he came back, Amy was gone. And 72 hours later, just about everyone in the state of Maine was asking the same question. Where did Amy go? On Thursday, October 18th, 2001, Amy St. Laurent stood in front of her clothes closet in the small Maine town of South Berwick. She had a big meeting coming up the next week at work, and she wanted to pick out just the right outfit. Amy was an attractive 25-year-old woman with strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes who wanted to become a model. She'd even gotten some professional photos done. But when it came to her job at Pratt & Whitney, which was an aircraft engine assembly plant, she wanted to be taken seriously. And that meant dressing professionally so that people didn't get the wrong idea from her looks and youth. But as Amy tried and rejected one outfit after another, she knew that the real reason she was making such a big deal out of this was to distract herself. She was trying to avoid thinking about the man who was coming to visit her that night from Florida. Amy had recently broken up with her boyfriend after living together on and off for 5 years. She wanted to get married and have kids, but she realized that her ex, Richard Sparrow, was just not the one. She liked to travel and go to museums, and the longer she'd been with Richard, the more she realized he was just a homebody who didn't care much about any of those things. She felt like breaking up with him was the right decision, but it was still hard. But now that she had broken up with him, she was able to rediscover the joy of being single. And a few weeks ago, she'd taken a trip to Florida, and she had met a handsome 27-year-old man named Eric Rubright, who had taken her out on his motorcycle. He'd even tried to kiss her, although Amy had politely declined. Ultimately, Amy had a lot of fun with Eric, and so when Eric asked if it was possible for him to travel to Maine to visit her, she said yes. But Amy was not interested in a romantic relationship again, and she didn't want to lead Eric on. So she made it absolutely clear to him that when he visited in Maine, nothing romantic could happen between them, and he would have to sleep in the spare room. Eric said he was totally fine with that, but just in case, Amy had another safeguard planned for this visit that she didn't mention to Eric. Her ex-boyfriend, Richard, had offered to come over and hang out with them as a buffer, like a third wheel. And now, standing in her bedroom, thinking about how potentially awkward this three-way dynamic was going to be, Amy hoped she did not make a mistake in either inviting Eric or inviting Richard. That evening, Eric arrived at Amy's apartment, and right away, things got off to a bumpy start. Despite what he said, Eric did not seem thrilled about sleeping in the spare bedroom. And he was clearly annoyed that Amy's ex-boyfriend, Richard, was just at the house with them. And then on Friday, which was the second day of Eric's visit, Amy and Eric got into a little fight. By Saturday, October 20th, so the third day of Eric's visit, Amy was just tired of Eric's constant grumpiness and disappointment. She'd been very clear with him that she did not want a romance, so Amy decided that for the rest of the time Eric was visiting, she would just go out and do the things that she thought they both would enjoy, and you know what, if Eric didn't like it, then so be it. So Amy took Eric to Boston to go to the Museum of Fine Arts, which was one of Amy's favorite places, and then afterwards, they went out for a nice dinner. And Amy noticed Eric seemed to be having a much better time now. So, as they were driving back towards Maine, Amy asked Eric if he was up for stopping in downtown Portland, which is a city in Maine. But as soon as Eric said yes, Amy immediately began worrying that she was underdressed for a big night out on the town. She was wearing jeans, sneakers, and a sweatshirt with their company's logo on it. She considered going home to change first, but at the same time, she didn't want to dress too provocatively and give Eric the wrong message, so she decided she would just go as is. Downtown Portland is a really popular spot, especially at night. And so when Eric and Amy got there, all the restaurants and bars that lined the cobblestone streets were packed, and mostly with young people. Amy suggested they stop at a sports bar, and Eric seemed interested. But as soon as they went inside, Eric began acting all disappointed again. Amy wanted to play a game of pool, like billiards, but Eric didn't. So Amy, determined not to have a terrible night, just went and found a couple of 20-something-year-old men named Russ and Cush who she could play with. Then the three of them would play, and they would talk and laugh, while Eric just kind of awkwardly stood by, drinking a beer and looking bored. After a while, though, Amy started worrying that she was being rude to Eric. So she took him to get some pizza, and even paid for his slices herself. Then she asked if he wanted to go to a cool club called the Pavilion that was partly inside an old bank vault. Amy hoped that the Pavilion would impress Eric, but as soon as they walked in, he got that annoying bored look on his face again, and he immediately said he didn't want to dance. And at this point, Amy was just kind of over Eric, And so she left Eric standing in line for drinks while she headed for the dance floor all on her own. On Sunday afternoon, so the following day, Amy's mother, Diane Jenkins, drummed her fingers on her laptop inside of her South Portland home, trying to burn off some nervous energy. She was getting concerned about her daughter. Amy had called her mother around 10 p.m. the night before, and Diane could tell from the sound of Amy's voice that she was in good spirits. Amy had said that she and her friend Eric were driving downtown, and so she asked her mom if she wanted to join them for a drink, since she lived pretty close. But Diane was already in her pajamas, so she said no. But after that, Amy had not called again, which was odd because the mother and daughter talked every day. Diane picked up the phone again and called her daughter's cell phone, but it went to voicemail for the fourth straight time. Diane wanted to think that Amy was just busy with her weekend guest Eric, but it had been hours and hours, and Amy never ignored her calls for this long. So Diane picked up her phone again, but this time she called her ex-husband, who was Amy's father. He lived close to Amy and took care of her cat whenever Amy was away for more than a few hours. But when Amy's dad picked up, he told Diane that he hadn't heard from their daughter either. And so Diane really started to worry that something could be wrong. The next morning, when still Amy had not called her mom, Diane called Amy's work. But the person who answered the phone call said Amy hadn't shown up, and she hadn't called ahead or emailed ahead to tell anyone why she was not coming into work. At this point, Diane felt a full-blown panic attack coming on as it dawned on her that her daughter truly had disappeared. And so Diane hung up on that call and then immediately called the police to report her daughter missing. That evening, which was October 22nd, 2001, Detective Danny Young flopped onto the sofa and flipped on Monday Night Football. It was the veteran detective's first night off since the 9/11 terror attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. For the past 6 weeks, Young had been investigating crimes by day for the Portland Police Department, and then by night, he and his bomb-detecting dog had been doing extra patrols, checking out the Portland Ferry for explosives, or checking out suspicious packages. And so at this moment, the detective's living room couch never felt so good. So when his phone rang a few minutes later, Detective Young wasn't sure if he even wanted to answer it. But he slowly did get off the couch and he picked up. And on the other line was a deputy sheriff from the county who said he needed Detective Young's help. He told Detective Young that the daughter of one of his friends was missing after she had spent the evening with a guy from out of town. The sheriff told Young that the woman's name was Amy St. Laurent, and her mother had already filed a missing person report in Portland, and her family had already gone out and begun putting up missing person posters all over the place. But police had not launched a full-scale investigation yet because Amy was an adult and she had not been gone for very long. But this deputy was wondering if maybe Detective Young could help off the books. Detective Young wanted to say no because he was exhausted, but Amy's disappearance felt oddly personal to him. He had a daughter who was not only Amy's age, but shared the same name. And like Amy St. Laurent, Young's daughter also loved going to the Pavilion nightclub. As the deputy sheriff told Young more about Amy and why her family was so worried, Young's gut told him something was wrong here. So he told the deputy he would look into this. After the call with the deputy sheriff ended, Detective Young called a supervisor to tell him he was going to investigate this Amy St. Laurent case. But the supervisor thought this was a bad idea, that it was a waste of time. A 25-year-old woman disappearing after a night of partying was not exactly big news. Maybe she had a hangover, or maybe she met up with a guy and didn't want to come home quite yet. Ultimately, the supervisor felt like the chances that something bad had happened to Amy were pretty slim. Also, the supervisor pointed out that this was Detective Young's first night off in a really long time, and he needed to take a break. But Young was adamant that he wanted to do this, and so after some convincing, his supervisor let him launch his own unofficial investigation. Before Detective Young left his house, he called a sergeant at the police station. Since Amy's friend, who she was with the night she disappeared, Eric Rubright, was from out of town, there was a good chance he had rented a car. So Detective Young wanted the sergeant to call the local rental agencies and see if any of them had a record of Eric renting a vehicle from them. And sure enough, the sergeant quickly called Young back. Not only did the sergeant know that Eric rented a maroon GMC Envoy, but she also had another important piece of information. The car Eric rented was equipped with a GPS tracker, which meant the rental company knew the vehicle's exact location in downtown Portland. Detective Young immediately sent some officers to stake out the rental car, and within an hour, Eric showed up right around 10:30 p.m., and strangely, he wasn't surprised to see the police officers at all. He told them he'd already seen the missing person posters that Amy's family were putting up all over Portland, and he said he was concerned about Amy too. And so the officers would take Eric back to the police station to ask him some questions. By the time Detective Young got to the interrogation room late that night, his fatigue from 6 straight weeks of work had disappeared. For the detective, it was like flipping a switch. The second he launched an investigation, it was the only thing he cared about, and he could focus like a laser beam no matter how tired he was. Eric was already sitting in the interrogation room, and the detective quickly sized him up. The first thing he noticed was how big Eric was. Eric had played semi-professional rugby, and Young thought how easy it would be for him to overpower someone Amy's size. But the second thing Young noticed was that Eric seemed agitated, like someone who was afraid he was in trouble. And as Detective Young peppered Eric with questions, Eric's story began to sound pretty odd. He claimed that on the night Amy was missing, they were at the Pavilion Club, and then after the last call, which was sometime between 12:45 and 1 a.m., Eric went to the bathroom. But he got stuck in a long line, and then by the time he got out of the bathroom, Amy had taken off, leaving him alone. So he got in his car and he circled the block once to see if he could find her, but when Amy didn't turn up, he decided that she would just have to find her own way home, and he left. But what made this story so hard to believe was that according to Eric, Amy had left her wallet, cell phone, purse, and car keys in his car. Detective Young was about to ask Eric to explain this when someone knocked on the door. Young frowned, but he knew nobody would interrupt unless it was really important, so he excused himself and stepped out of the room. And once he had, an officer handed him a phone, and when Young put it to his ear, he heard his sergeant's voice. The sergeant said he was with 3 young men who had flagged down his patrol car to tell him they were with Amy the night she disappeared and they needed to talk to police right now. Detective Young told the sergeant to bring them in right away. But Detective Young had to get back to his interview with Eric, so he assigned other detectives to talk to the 3 young men and just report back to him. The 3 young men eventually arrived at the police station, and they introduced themselves to the detectives. They were Russ Gorman, Kush Sharma, and their other roommate. And obviously Russ and Kush were the 2 young men that Amy had played pool with on the night she went missing. And they would tell the detectives that recently a bartender had showed them the missing person poster of Amy, and they instantly recognized her as the woman they had played pool with. And so as soon as they saw it, they left the bar and flagged down the first patrol car they saw. Russ was a charming guy who had very stylized hair. He had frosted tips, which meant the ends of his hair, kind of all throughout his hair, were bleached blonde, and he gelled his hair up. And although he'd only been in Portland for 18 months, he was already a regular in the bar scene there. And he would tell the detective that he and his buddy Kush had been playing pool when Amy had come over and asked to join their game. And Russ would say that actually he and Amy hit it off right away, and he actually asked for her phone number. But Russ made it clear he did not expect this to go anywhere, because he watched as Amy literally went back to her date, and so Russ and Kush just left and went to another bar. But then the 2 men went to the Pavilion nightclub, where sure enough, they ran into Amy again. This was around the time that Amy had gone to the dance floor on her own. She saw Russ and Kush, and the 3 of them basically started dancing together. And so Russ would tell the detectives that the 3 of them just danced all night, and then after last call, Russ said he wanted to keep partying, so he invited Amy to come back to their apartment. He told her they were going to have an after-hours birthday party for their 3rd roommate, and he wanted Amy to join them. And so she agreed, and they all got to the apartment at around 1:15 a.m. But the birthday party never really materialized, and Russ could tell Amy was really bored, and so eventually he just asked Amy if she wanted a ride back home. And Amy actually said that she wanted a ride back to the pavilion because then she could go find her date, Eric, and he could give her a ride home. And if for some reason she couldn't find him, her mom's house was right nearby and she could just walk there. So at about 2 a.m., Russ dropped off Amy right outside the pavilion on the curb, and then after watching her head towards the pavilion, Russ just drove home and stayed there for the rest of the night. And when detectives spoke to the other two roommates, they would tell basically the exact same version of the story. The detectives were excited. It sounded like Russ may have been the last person to see Amy alive, and so they rushed to tell Detective Young what they had learned. Detective Young was still talking to Eric when the detectives knocked again on their door. And when Young stepped out and they told him what Russ and the roommates said, a new theory popped up in Detective Young's head. He wondered if maybe Eric saw Amy get dropped off by some other guy, and maybe that sent him into a jealous rage. But when Detective Young walked back into the interview room and sat down, he said nothing to Eric about what he had just learned. Instead, he asked Eric to go over all of his actions after Amy had left the club without him. Young wanted to see if he could maybe catch Eric in a lie. Eric claimed that after he realized Amy was gone, he just drove himself back to Amy's house and then let himself inside using Amy's key. But when he didn't find Amy inside, he said he felt weird about staying in her house all alone, so he slept outside in his car. The next morning, Eric said he left his car and went back inside of Amy's house to use her shower and also to drop off all her belongings she had left in his car. And then afterwards, he said he did leave an angry note pinned to her apartment door, and then he left her coat outside right on the hood of her car, and he dropped her keys onto one of her tires. And that was the end of his weekend. When Eric stopped talking, Detective Young couldn't help but feel like this guy's story just seemed totally off. And soon he would have yet another interruption that would confirm his suspicion. Suddenly, another detective called Young out of the interview room to tell him that Amy's neighbor had called her local police department on Sunday with her own concerns about Amy's safety. She'd seen Amy's expensive coat on the ground beside her car on Sunday morning, so she had knocked on Amy's door to see if she was okay. But it wasn't just the coat that made the neighbors nervous. On Friday night, the neighbor had seen Eric angrily peeling out of Amy's driveway, and when the neighbor actually asked Amy what was going on, Amy said Eric was furious with her because Amy didn't want to have sex with him. So when this neighbor saw the coat on Sunday morning, and then she knocked on Amy's door and Amy didn't answer, this neighbor went and got Amy's keys from the landlord, and when she went inside and realized it was empty, she called the police. Detective Young had never in his life had so many witnesses volunteer to help out on a case, and every single witness story really seemed to point the finger at Eric. And it was easy to imagine Eric being mad after driving all the way to Maine from Florida only to be rejected. And the neighbor's story was especially damning for Eric, because it meant that Eric was already enraged that Amy wouldn't sleep with him the day before Amy had left him for two other guys at the pavilion. And Detective Young thought Eric's story about driving to Amy's house and sleeping in his car on a night when the weather was in the low 40s, so nearly freezing outside, was nonsense. But when Young went back in to question Eric about all of this, Eric did something very unexpected. He said he had proof that he drove to Amy's apartment late on the night she disappeared. Then he pulled out a receipt from a gas station, which was located on the way to Amy's apartment. And Eric told Detective Young that if this receipt wasn't enough, he also had a witness. On his drive to Amy's, he had to pass through a toll, but he didn't have any money. And the toll taker had basically taken pity on him and let him through anyway, and so as a result of that, Eric was confident she would remember him. By now, Detective Young's head was spinning. This was the most chaotic interview he had ever conducted. Usually, investigators had to hunt for tips, but tonight they were pouring in too fast for him to even keep up with. The detective felt like Eric really was his best suspect, but Russ had been the last person to see Amy alive, so he couldn't be ruled out yet. But this actually wasn't even the biggest question that Detective Young faced, because Amy's disappearance actually wasn't officially a criminal case at all. Amy was an adult, and she'd only been gone for 2 days. Her friends and family were obviously worried, but as of now, there was no evidence that any crime had even been committed. Amy might actually be just fine. Some of the other detectives thought Detective Young was kind of overreacting. They thought Amy was going to waltz in any minute, wondering what all the fuss was about. The next morning, so 3 days after Amy disappeared, police went to her apartment to go look around. They found the key to her apartment sitting on the tire of her car, exactly the way Eric had described. But when they found Eric's angry note he had left inside, they discovered that it was much nastier than Eric had said it was. In the letter, Eric asked Amy very angrily where she'd gone, with a choice curse word thrown in. It was very clear Eric must have left feeling very mad, chucking Amy's coat as he left. When they searched Amy's apartment, the police took her computer, her mail, her answering machine, and even her diary. And as they flipped through the pages of her diary, they found pages of Amy's deepest thoughts, her struggles, her fears, and her hopes. But there was one name that kept coming up over and over again in this diary. It was Amy's ex, Richard Sparrow. In fact, she'd started this diary the day after she had broken up with him. So that day, the police picked Richard up at his house, they drove him to the station, and they put him in the same interrogation room where Detective Young had just questioned Eric the night before. And when Richard told the detective that he had slept over at Amy's place on the first night that Eric was visiting, Young felt his heart start to race. It was hard to imagine a more awkward or potentially explosive arrangement than having an ex-boyfriend sleeping on the couch while Amy's new man slept in the guest room. It was the type of situation where you could understand one or both of these men getting really mad. But Richard would tell Detective Young that truly he was on friendly terms with Amy and that he had only stayed in her apartment on Friday as a favor to her after she begged him to. And also, on the night that Amy disappeared, Richard said he went out in South Berwick with friends and then went home, an account that Richard's roommates all confirmed, which meant he was very likely many miles away from Portland when Amy went missing. So this interview with Richard really had Detective Young turn his sights back towards Eric and Russ, the two men who were chasing Amy on the night she vanished. As the days went by with no word on the whereabouts of their daughter, Amy's parents became increasingly desperate. On Thursday, October 25th, almost a week after Amy disappeared, her mother Diane went to the media and offered a $35,000 reward for information that would lead to Amy's safe return. And by now, Amy's case was no longer an off-the-books investigation by Detective Young. This was now a full-scale police operation. As a reminder to himself of just what was at stake, Detective Young put a photo of Amy on his desk. By now, Detective Young was pretty sure he knew which one was responsible for Amy's disappearance, but he couldn't prove it. So for now, he was just going to treat Eric and Russ like equal suspects. When Young had checked both men's backgrounds, he'd found they both had criminal records. Russ was on probation for theft, and the night he gave Amy a ride, he was driving with a suspended license, and facing the prospect of having his license revoked entirely. Eric had some minor drug offenses on his record, but more alarming was his ex-girlfriend in Florida had a restraining order against him. Weirdly, her name was also Amy, and she even kind of looked like Amy St. Laurent. Police had begun a much more aggressive search for Amy. Sheriff's deputies retraced Eric's route from the nightclub back to Amy's apartment, checking anywhere that somebody might be able to hide a body, but they found nothing. Police in surrounding communities looked through abandoned buildings, and they searched the train tracks and highways and the edges of the harbor. National Guard helicopters searched from above, and detectives even spent their own time looking for Amy on weekends. But no one could find any trace of Amy. Meanwhile, both primary suspects left town. Eric went back to Florida, where he lived and worked, while Russ went to Alabama, since he had family there. Usually, Detective Young would want to keep his suspects close, But in this case, he was actually happy that both men had left. He figured the killer might relax once he was away from Portland, and maybe he might confess something to somebody close to him. 5 weeks later, there was still no sign of Amy, and everyone at this point feared she was dead. Officers who had initially been skeptical that Amy was even in trouble were now drawn into the case out of real concern for the young woman. They'd learned so much about Amy during the investigation, not just the details of the last few days before she vanished, but the details of her life, how kind she was and how spontaneously generous. One couple told police that Amy gave them money out of her savings one Christmas when they didn't have money to buy presents for their kid. Another friend told police that Amy one time had paid for a plane ticket so the friend could fly home to celebrate her parents' 50th wedding anniversary. Amy even took a leave of absence from work to stay at a friend's bedside when they were in a coma in the hospital. Some of the officers began referring to Amy as, quote, our Amy, almost like they were her father. Detective Young found himself constantly looking at that photo of Amy he kept on his desk, and whenever he looked at her, he felt like she was looking back at him, pleading with him to help her. And as time dragged on without any breakthrough, people in Portland began getting scared that a killer was literally on the loose among them. And you gotta remember that this was around the time right after 9/11, so Americans at this time were very much on edge. And now Amy's disappearance had only made the paranoia much worse for people in Portland. As the lead detective in the hunt for Amy, Detective Young felt like so far he was letting the public down, especially her family. But he didn't really know what else to do. Without a body, he had no crime scene and no evidence, and so he was totally stalled. And that's when Detective Young got an unusual offer. A lieutenant from the Maine Warden Service named Pat Dorian thought he might be able to help find Amy. Every year, Dorian and his team found over 300 lost hikers, mostly people who got turned around inside of Maine's vast forests. Even though they'd never looked for a dead body before, the lieutenant thought the wardens might be able to apply their expertise to this case. Detective Young wasn't sure that a bunch of game wardens could help, but winter was coming, and once there was snow on the ground, finding a body would be much more difficult, if not impossible. So Detective Young told the lieutenant that yes, he would like his help. So on Monday, December 3rd, which was 6 weeks after Amy had vanished, Detective Young squeezed into a crowded conference room at the police station and took a seat at the conference table. Detective Young's team sat on one side and Lieutenant Dorian's on the other, all of them looking over a table full of equipment, computers, and mapping programs. Detective Young began by showing the wardens all the places the police had already searched. But Dorian really wanted to know more about the suspects, so his team could get a better sense of where either man might go to dispose of a body. So Dorian asked questions like, how familiar were they with the woods and the outdoors? And were they the kind of people who would feel comfortable hiking into an unfamiliar area? Detective Young decided he would just focus on the one suspect he was pretty sure was responsible for Amy's disappearance, which by this point he fully expected was a murder. It was a gamble what he was doing, but in his experience, Young had seen that the more focused a search is, the better the results. So for hours, the people at this table, Dorian, Young, their teams, discussed every detail of the case, and about the one suspect that he was focusing on. But a question from the wardens caught the detectives by surprise. Did their suspect have access to a shovel? And surprisingly, despite all their interviews and questions, none of the detectives had any idea. So immediately after the meeting, Detective Young asked other investigators to find out whether the suspect had a shovel. And right away, word came back that the suspect did have a shovel, and in fact, he had borrowed the shovel recently. 5 days later, at 6:30 a.m. on December 8th, 2001, a new, massive search for Amy began. 100 officers and 45 Maine search and rescue volunteers fanned out across southern Maine, along with cadaver dogs that are trained to smell dead bodies. But after hours of searching, the team found nothing. The cadaver dogs indicated that they smelled something a few times, but it turned out to just be nothing but dead animals. Then, around 1 p.m., searchers turned down a side road off the highway that had been used to haul gravel to expand the road. At the end were trails that led off into the brush and some debris from the construction. With snow closing in, the searchers spread out in a line shoulder to shoulder and marched into the woods just as they had at other potential burial spots. And after about 30 minutes of this, one of the searchers ducked under a branch and they came upon a spot where the earth seemed to have been pressed down and kind of smoothed over. So the searchers brought over the dogs, and right away the dogs were barking and pointing at that spot on the ground. Searchers immediately yelled out for Detective Young to come over, and when he did come over and he looked down at the spot, he could see there were some pine needles that had been thrown over this area, almost like to disguise it, and so it seemed very likely this was a burial spot. And sure enough, when searchers got their shovels and began digging in that spot, they would uncover Amy's badly decomposed body. The next day, Sunday, December 9th, the medical examiner conducted Amy's autopsy. And from this autopsy, it was clear that Amy had been beaten and shot. But there wasn't much other physical evidence to go on. There were no fingerprints or DNA from the killer on the body. In fact, her body was so decomposed that the medical examiner needed Amy's dental records just to confirm it was really her. 5 days later, on Friday, December 14th, Amy's family held a memorial for her at a funeral home in South Portland. 25 white candles surrounded a photo of Amy, one for every year of her life. Beside the memorial sat a bouquet of pink roses, just like the flowers that her father would give her every year for her birthday. Detective Young would have loved to be at Amy's service, but he couldn't go because at that very moment, he was in his car driving south on his way to pick up the killer. Even though the killer had left the state, detectives had kept a close eye on him. And when Amy's body was found, they finally got their break, because the killer had believed police would never find the body, and so when they did, the killer panicked. He called someone and he confessed to the crime. Finally, all the pieces fell together, and for the first time, Detective Young knew what really happened to Amy. In the early morning hours of Sunday, October 21st, the killer asked Amy if she wanted a ride home. At least that's what he told her he was going to do, because in reality, the killer had other plans in mind. When Amy got in the car, the killer kept staring at her. He thought she was absolutely stunning, and he was sure that if he could just make the right move, something might happen romantically between them. So he turned on the radio, found a good song, and began to drive. Eventually, the killer got onto the highway, at which point Amy told him he was going the wrong way. The killer told her that he was just going to take her for a moonlit walk. It was going to be great. But Amy said she had no interest in that and just wanted to be taken home. But the killer wasn't prepared to do that. So he pulled off the highway to a secluded spot, and he turned to Amy and said, "Please, just give me a chance." Then he told her how pretty she was and how attracted he was to her, hoping this might make her want to stay out longer with him, but it only made her more agitated, and she eventually demanded to be taken home right now. And at first, the killer did begin driving back on the highway as if he was going to take her home, but then he turned down a side road, at which point Amy began screaming at him to turn around and bring me home right now. The killer could feel anger boiling up inside of him to the point where he just couldn't control it anymore. So he pulled the car over on the side of the road, he put it in park, and then he turned and just wound up and punched Amy. Stunned, Amy leapt out of the car and just began running. But the killer had more than just fists to hurt Amy with. He grabbed a gun from under the seat and then ran out after her. And when he caught up to her, he couldn't contain his anger. He hit her again across the face with the gun, splitting her lip and chipping her tooth. Then he hit her for a third time, this time hard enough to break a bone in her face. Amy tried to fight back, but her killer was much stronger, and he knocked her to the ground and pinned her down. They struggled for a while, and at some point the killer tore at Amy's clothes and sexually assaulted her, and then when he was done, he grabbed his gun again. He knew if he were to let Amy go, he'd get in big trouble. So instead, he put that gun to the right side of Amy's head, and he pulled the trigger. The killer knew he needed to hide the body now, but he knew he couldn't do much in the dark, so he dragged her body into the nearby forest where she was out of sight, and then he left her for the night. And then the next day, he returned with a shovel, and he buried her. Even before Amy's body was found, Detective Young had already begun to suspect one person much more than anybody else. Detectives actually managed to find surveillance video of Eric at a gas station alone at 1:36 a.m. on the night Amy went missing, just as Eric had claimed. They also found the turnpike toll taker who remembered taking pity on Eric when he couldn't pay the toll. And so with all that corroboration, police didn't think it was possible for Eric to have returned to Portland to pick up Amy by 2 a.m., the time Russ said he had dropped her off. But police had a harder time verifying Russ's claim that he had driven Amy from his apartment to the Portland nightclub and then returned home in just 25 minutes. Russ's roommates had vouched for him, but their stories didn't hold up. His roommate claimed he knew Russ came in around 2:25 a.m. because he was in the middle of writing an email to his aunt when Russ walked in. But when police looked through his emails, there was no record that he actually sent any email to his aunt. And police could not find a single person who actually saw Russ drop off Amy at the pavilion. Instead, police found evidence that Russ was lying. He got pulled over by police on the night that Amy went missing at around 3:14 a.m. for not dimming his high beam lights. So clearly he hadn't come home quickly and then stayed home like he had claimed, because here he was out and about at 3:14. Then, after Amy disappeared, police found that Russ had borrowed a shovel from his mom's boyfriend, and the location of her body where she was buried, it was found less than 4/10 of a mile from Russ's mother's house. And in addition to all that evidence, Russ actually just confessed the entire crime to his mother after news broke that Amy's body had been found. On Monday, June 30th, 2003, Russ Gorman was convicted of killing Amy and sentenced to 60 years in prison. Amy's mother would go on to found the Amy St. Laurent Foundation, which was set up to help educate women and children of all ages in awareness, prevention, and techniques to protect themselves in dangerous or life-threatening situations. The organization is still active today. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts, and you will find all of them. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you listened to today, but in video format on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. Go check it out. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
On the night of December 19th, 1979, an 18-year-old girl named Michelle Martinko drove to Westdale Mall in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And nothing about that should have been dangerous. It was a mall. It was the week before Christmas, so the parking lot was busy. The stores were bright, and there were people everywhere. Parents were walking from shop to shop with bags in both hands. Teenagers were moving through the mall in little groups. Employees were watching the clock waiting for closing time. Michelle was not going there to meet some mysterious person. She was not sneaking away from her family. She was not driving down a dark road outside of town. She was going to buy a coat. That was it. One normal errand. And that is what makes the beginning of this story so hard to sit with. Because when someone disappears from a dangerous place, your mind can at least understand the shape of it. But Michelle did not go to a dangerous place. She went somewhere public, somewhere familiar, somewhere that looked safe, because there were lights, stores, music, families, and witnesses all around her. But a few hours later, Michelle still had not come home. At first, her family did what any family would do. They tried to explain it. Maybe she ran into friends. Maybe she was still shopping. Maybe the mall was crowded. Maybe she had stopped somewhere else on the way home. Maybe she was already driving back. But then more time passed. The phone did not ring. The driveway stayed empty. And those simple explanations started to feel less and less believable. So eventually police were called. And the search led right back to the place Michelle was supposed to be, Westdale Mall. By then, the mall was different. The Christmas noise was gone. The shoppers had left. The doors were locked. The bright windows that had felt so normal earlier in the night now looked cold and empty from the parking lot. And then officers found Michelle's family car. It was still sitting there. At first, that seemed like a clue. It told them Michelle had made it to the mall. It told them she had not driven away. It told them that whatever happened had happened before she could leave that parking lot. But when officers walked up to the car and looked inside, they realized it was not just a clue, it was the crime scene. Michelle was inside the car, and right away the case changed from a missing person call into something much worse. Investigators could tell this was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. Michelle had been attacked, and whoever did it had somehow managed to vanish from one of the busiest places in Cedar Rapids during one of the busiest weeks of the year. That one fact made the case feel almost impossible. Because think about how many people must have passed through that mall that night. People going in, people coming out, cars pulling into spaces, cars backing out, employees locking up, friends saying goodbye, parents loading shopping bags into trunks. And somewhere inside all of that normal movement, something terrible happened, and nobody saw enough to stop it. Or if someone did see something, they did not know what they were looking at. That became one of the first problems investigators faced. They needed witnesses. They needed a timeline. They needed to know when Michelle entered the mall, where she walked, who she spoke to, when she returned to the parking lot, and whether anyone had been near her car. So detectives began doing the only thing they could do. They started building the night backwards. They talked to Michelle's family. They spoke with her friends. They went to the mall. They asked employees if they remembered seeing her. They asked shoppers if they noticed anyone strange. They asked whether Michelle had seemed worried, distracted, or afraid. And slowly, they began to understand the shape of Michelle's final evening. Earlier that night, she had attended a school banquet. She was a senior in high school, and by all accounts, she had a full life in front of her. She was social. She had friends. She had a family that expected her home. She had the kind of ordinary future that nobody thinks can disappear in one night. After the banquet, she decided to make one quick stop at the mall. She wanted to check on a coat. That detail mattered because it showed how ordinary her decision was. Michelle was not stepping into a risky situation. She was doing the kind of thing thousands of teenagers do without thinking twice. She drove to the mall. She parked. She went inside. And then at some point, she made her way back toward the car. That is where the mystery tightened. Because if Michelle had left the mall alone, then someone may have been waiting for her. If she had left with someone, then investigators needed to know who And if someone followed her from inside the mall, then that person had moved through a public place close enough to her to choose a moment, but normal-looking enough that no one stopped them. That possibility was chilling, because it meant the person responsible might not have looked dangerous at all. They might have looked like any other shopper, any other employee, any other person trying to get home before Christmas. And in those first days, that was the fear that spread through Cedar Rapids. Not just that Michelle was gone, but that the person who did it could have walked right past everyone. Detectives searched for a motive. Was it robbery? That did not seem to fit. Was it someone she knew? Maybe. Was it a random attack? That was possible too, but harder to prove. And when a case has no obvious motive, it becomes much harder to solve. Because detectives are not just asking who had a reason, they are asking who had the opportunity. And opportunity can belong to a terrifying number of people. Still, the investigators had one thing that gave them a reason to keep pushing. Michelle had fought back. That meant the person responsible may have left something behind. A trace, a piece of evidence, something small, something that in 1979 could not do very much. But investigators kept it. They preserved what they could. They documented the scene. They held on to the evidence because even then, good investigators understood something important. Science changes. A clue that is silent today might not be silent forever. But in those first weeks and months, science was not ready. There was no genetic genealogy. There was no way to take a small, unknown sample and follow it through a web of distant relatives. There was no way to turn a biological trace into a family tree. So the evidence stayed quiet, and the case kept moving the old way. Interview after interview, tip after tip, name after name, lead after lead. Some looked promising for a moment. Most went nowhere. And as time passed, the pressure on the investigation changed. The first wave of shock faded. The headlines moved on. The mall stayed open. People still drove there, still parked their cars, still walked under the same lights. But Michelle's family did not move on. For them, every day without an answer became its own kind of sentence. Because there is a special cruelty in an unsolved case. You do not only lose the person, you lose the ability to understand the story of what happened. You are left with a beginning and an ending, but the middle is missing. And the middle is where the answer lives. Who approached her? Why her? Did she know them? Did she realize she was in danger before it was too late? Those questions stayed with her family. They stayed with investigators. They stayed with Cedar Rapids. And slowly, Michelle's case moved into the place every family fears. It was still open. It was still remembered. But it was no longer moving. Years passed. The mall changed. People who were teenagers that winter became adults. Detectives retired. Files were boxed, reviewed, reopened, and reviewed again. And inside those files, one clue remained from the night Michelle never came home. It was small. It was quiet. And for a long time, it could not tell anyone a name. But nearly 40 years later, that clue would point investigators toward a man who had lived an ordinary life in Iowa the whole time. A man who had never been at the center of the original investigation. A man whose name was not waiting in an old witness statement. A man who, for decades, had no idea that the evidence from that winter night had not disappeared with time. It was waiting. To understand why Michelle Martinko's case became so frustrating, you have to go back to the first few hours after her car was found. Because in the beginning, detectives still had something every cold case loses over time. They had momentum. They had fresh witnesses. They had a fresh scene. They had a family who knew exactly where Michelle was supposed to be. They had a mall full of people who had been there only hours earlier. and they had a narrow window of time where something had gone terribly wrong. So the first question was simple. What did Michelle do after the banquet? Earlier that evening, Michelle had been at a choir banquet at the Sheraton Inn in Cedar Rapids. It was a normal school event. She was dressed nicely. She was with classmates. She was not acting afraid. She was not telling people she was in trouble. From the outside, nothing about that evening looked like the beginning of a criminal investigation. After the banquet, Michelle did not head straight home. She wanted to go to Westdale Mall, and this is one of those details that matters more than it seems to at first. Because Michelle did not appear to have planned some secret meeting. She was going there for something simple, a winter coat. Her mother had put one on layaway, and Michelle wanted to check on it. But Michelle did not necessarily want to go alone. Before she left, she asked at least one friend if she wanted to come with her. That friend could not go. Another person was considered too, but in the end, Michelle went to the mall by herself. And that one small change, that one ordinary moment where someone says, "No, I can't go tonight," became one of the most painful details in the whole case. Because if someone had gone with her, maybe the night would have ended differently. Maybe two people walking back to the car would have made the attacker leave. Maybe there would have been a witness sitting in the passenger seat. Maybe Michelle would have gone straight home. But that is the trap of a cold case. Everyone can see the small turns after they happen. No one can see them before. So Michelle drove to Westdale Mall alone. Once she got there, she did what everyone expected her to do. She went inside. She walked through the stores. She spoke to people she knew. She was seen by others. She was alive, normal, and still inside the world where the night could have ended safely. And then, sometime close to closing, she was seen near the inside of the mall. That sighting became important because it helped detectives build the final part of the timeline. Michelle was still alive near the end of the shopping night. Her car was outside, and at some point after being seen inside, she walked back toward that car. That is the moment investigators needed to understand, because something happened between the mall doors and the vehicle. Maybe someone approached her as she unlocked the car. Maybe someone was already near the car. Maybe someone followed her out. Maybe she recognized the person and did not feel danger immediately. Or maybe she had no time to understand what was happening. Detectives had to consider all of it. And because there was no security footage to answer those questions, they had to depend on people. That sounds simple, but it is not. A mall in December is busy. People are distracted. They are carrying bags, looking for keys, thinking about dinner, thinking about Christmas, thinking about anything except memorizing the face of a stranger walking through a parking lot. So when investigators asked people what they saw, the answers were incomplete. Someone may have seen a person. Someone may have noticed a car. Someone may have heard something. But nothing came together cleanly. There was no one witness who could say, "I saw this man do it." No one could hand police the answer. And without that, detectives had to spread out. They looked at people who knew Michelle, friends, classmates, people from school, people connected to the mall, people who might have seen her that night. And they also had to consider the possibility that the person responsible had no real connection to her at all. That was the possibility that made the case feel so wide open. Because if Michelle had been targeted by someone she knew, then detectives could search her life for conflict. They could look for jealousy arguments, obsession, or anyone who had been acting strangely. But if the attacker was a stranger, then the circle became much larger. It could be someone from Cedar Rapids. It could be someone passing through. It could be someone who had gone to the mall for the same reason everyone else had gone there. And in a public place like that, with hundreds of people moving in and out, that was almost impossible to narrow down. Still, investigators kept working. They checked whether robbery was the motive. But that did not seem to explain it. They checked whether Michelle had enemies. That did not point anywhere obvious. They checked whether anyone had been bothering her or following her. There were concerns and rumors, but nothing that immediately solved the case. They collected physical evidence from the car. They preserved clothing and other items. They looked for fingerprints, traces, anything that could help them identify the person who had been close to her. And one thing stood out. The person responsible may have left behind biological evidence. In a modern case, that sentence changes everything. Today, if investigators have unknown DNA from a crime scene, the whole investigation can move in a completely different direction. They can compare it to databases. They can build profiles. They can follow family trees. They can narrow a stranger into a surname, then a family, then, sometimes, one person. But in 1979, that was not possible. Back then, the evidence could be collected, but not fully understood. It was like having a locked safe in the evidence room and knowing something important was inside, but not having the tool to open it. So the case remained dependent on interviews, tips, and old-fashioned police work. And the tips came. People called. People talked. People gave names. Some were trying to help. Some were repeating rumors. Some thought they had seen something. Others had theories. Each tip had to be checked, and every time a new lead came in, it created a tiny moment of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this person knew something. Maybe this name would finally connect to the car. But then the lead would fade. The person had an alibi. The story did not hold up. The timing was wrong. The evidence did not match what could be tested back then, or the lead simply led nowhere. That cycle is exhausting for a family. It is also exhausting for investigators, because each new possibility opens the wound again. Then, when it fails, the silence after it feels even heavier. Michelle's parents lived inside that cycle for years. They waited for phone calls. They watched news coverage. They spoke to police. They hoped someone would finally remember something important. And at the same time, they had to live in a city where the mall was still there. The parking lot was still there. People still drove past the place where their daughter's life ended, sometimes without even knowing what had happened there. As months turned into years, the investigation did not stop, but it changed. That is what happens to a case when the first wave is over. The urgency does not disappear for the family, but the public energy begins to fade. Reporters move on. People who were scared start feeling safe again. The mall becomes just a mall again. But for detectives, the file stays open. And for Michelle's family, the question never leaves. Who was he? That was the question. Not just legally, emotionally. Who was the person who came close enough to her in that parking lot? Who was the person who left the mall and went back into the world? Did he watch the news? Did he see Michelle's face in the newspaper? Did he hear people in Cedar Rapids talking about what happened and stay quiet? And maybe the most disturbing question was this: did he keep living nearby? Because if the attacker was a stranger with no obvious connection to Michelle, then there was no reason he could not have gone back to a completely ordinary life. He could have gotten up the next morning, gone to work, talked to neighbors, sat at dinner with family, and no one around him would know. That is what made the case so haunting. It was not only that Michelle was gone, it was that the person responsible was still somewhere, unnamed, unrecognized, and possibly invisible, because he looked just like everyone else. Years passed. Investigators reviewed the file again and again. They rechecked old leads. They compared old evidence to new possibilities. They watched science slowly improve from something that could only narrow a suspect pool into something that might someday identify a person. But for a long time, some day did not arrive. And as the decades moved forward, Michelle's parents faced the cruelest part of waiting. They did not know if they would live long enough to hear the answer. Her father died in the 1990s. Her mother died a few years later. Both of them left the world without seeing anyone convicted for what happened to their daughter. And that could have been the end of it. For many cold cases, that is how the story closes. The original investigators retire. The parents pass away. The witnesses grow old. The mall changes. The city moves on. The file remains, but only as a reminder of what could not be solved. But Michelle's case had one thing that time had not destroyed: evidence. And in 2006, more than 25 years after the night at Westdale Mall, a cold case investigator opened the file again. This time, he was not just looking for old names. He was looking for something the first detectives had saved, without knowing how important it would become. A trace from the person who had been inside that car with Michelle. And when that trace was tested with newer technology, the case finally changed. For the first time in decades, the unknown man from the mall was no longer just a shadow. He had a DNA profile, but even then, the answer did not come right away. Because when investigators entered that profile into the national system, there was no match. So now, they had something incredibly powerful and incredibly frustrating. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint. They just did not have his name. For years, that was the strange position detectives were in. They had evidence. They had a DNA profile. They had something that almost certainly belonged to the person who had been with Michelle in that car. But they did not have a name. And that is one of the most frustrating things about forensic evidence. People think DNA automatically solves a case. They imagine a detective puts a sample into a computer, waits a few seconds, and then a name pops up on the screen. But that is not how it works. DNA is powerful only if there is something to compare it to. If the person is already in a database, then maybe you get a hit. If a close relative is in a database, maybe you get a direction. But if nobody connected to that person is there, then all you have is a profile. A very important profile, but still just a profile. So in Michelle's case, investigators have the genetic fingerprint of the man they believed was responsible. But when they searched the official system, nothing came back. No name, no match, no arrest. And so the case went quiet again, but not dead. That is the key. It went quiet, but it did not die. Because inside the Cedar Rapids Police Department, there were investigators who understood that the evidence was now the center of the case. The old interviews still mattered. The old tips still mattered. The old timeline still mattered. But the DNA was different. The DNA was not a rumor. It was not someone's memory from decades earlier. It was not a theory. It was a direct physical connection to the crime scene. And if science kept improving, then maybe one day that connection could be followed all the way to a person. So the evidence stayed preserved. The file stayed open. And the case waited. Years passed again. And during those years, something began happening outside of police departments that would completely change cold cases. People started sending their DNA to genealogy companies. At first, most people were not thinking about crime. They were thinking about ancestry. They wanted to know where their family came from. They wanted to see percentages, regions, migration paths. They wanted to find distant cousins. They wanted to fill in old branches of family trees. It felt harmless, personal, even fun. But for investigators working cold cases, this new world created a possibility that had never existed before. Because if an unknown DNA profile did not match a criminal database, maybe it could still match a distant relative in a public genealogy database. And if it matched a distant relative, then investigators could begin working backwards, not from a suspect to the evidence, from the evidence to a family. That was the breakthrough. And that is where Michelle's case started to change. In 2017, investigators turned to newer DNA technology. They wanted to learn anything they could about the person behind the unknown sample. Even if they still could not get a name, maybe they could get a direction. Maybe the DNA could suggest what he might have looked like. Maybe it could narrow the field. Maybe it could make the shadows slightly less blurry. That process did not solve the case by itself, but it helped keep the investigation moving. Then in 2018, investigators took the next step. They used genetic genealogy, and this time, the DNA did not stay silent. It found relatives, not close enough to say, this is the person, but close enough to say, you need to look at this family line. And that changed everything, because now investigators were no longer staring at the entire population and asking, who could this be? They were looking at family trees. They were looking at branches. They were looking at surnames, marriages, children, cousins, grandparents, and lines that moved through Iowa. This kind of work is slow. It is not dramatic in the way people imagine police work. There is no chase. No dramatic knock on the door right away. It is paperwork. It is databases. It is building family trees, one generation at a time. It is finding one person, then their parents, then their siblings, then their children, then distant cousins, then checking who was the right age, who lived close enough, who could have been in Cedar Rapids in 1979. And every time one branch does not fit, you cut it away. Then you move to the next branch, and then the next, until the tree gets smaller. That is what happened in Michelle's case. Investigators began eliminating people. Some relatives were too young. Some were too old. Some were women, and the DNA profile indicated they were looking for a man. Some lived too far away. Some did not fit the timeline. Branch by branch, the massive tree became smaller, and eventually investigators reached a point where the evidence seemed to point toward one small group. 3 brothers. That was the moment the case changed, from a cold case investigation into something much more focused. Because now detectives were not looking for a stranger in the entire city. They were looking at 3 specific men, 3 brothers from Iowa, and one of them they believed could be the man whose DNA had been sitting in the evidence for nearly 40 years. But believing that is not enough. They needed proof. They could not just walk in and accuse someone because a family tree pointed in that direction. They needed a direct DNA comparison, and that created a new problem. How do you get DNA from someone who does not know they are being investigated? In some cases, police can ask for a voluntary sample. But if the person refuses, or if asking too early warns them, investigators may lose the chance to build the case quietly. So detectives began watching. They watched the brothers. They looked for a way to legally collect something one of them threw away. And that is when the case came down to one of the smallest, most ordinary objects imaginable, a drinking straw. In October of 2018, investigators watched one of the brothers, a man named Jerry Lynn Burns, drinking from a straw. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. A man having a drink, a straw used once and thrown away. Trash. But to the investigators, that straw was not trash. It was a possible answer, because when a person uses a straw, they leave cells behind. And if investigators could collect it after he discarded it, they could compare his DNA to the unknown DNA from Michelle's case. So they waited. Burns threw the straw away, and investigators collected it. Think about how strange that is. For almost 40 years, detectives had been waiting for a name. Michelle's family had been waiting for a name. Cedar Rapids had been waiting for a name. And now, after all that time, The case came down to whether the DNA on a discarded straw matched the DNA preserved from a winter night in 1979. The straw was tested, and when the results came back, they were exactly what investigators had been waiting for. The DNA matched. Jerry Burns was no longer just one name from a family tree. He was now directly connected to the evidence from Michelle's case, and this created a question that was almost impossible to ignore. If Jerry Burns had no real connection to Michelle, if he had not been part of the original investigation, if he had lived for decades without being tied to the case, then how did his DNA end up connected to the crime scene? That was the question detectives were ready to ask him, but they still had to be careful, because after nearly 40 years, one mistake could damage everything. So investigators prepared for the next step. They needed to speak with Burns. They needed to see how he reacted. They needed to ask whether he knew Michelle, whether he had ever been at Westdale Mall, whether he had any explanation for why his DNA would be connected to the evidence. And there was something almost eerie about the timing, because the date was approaching December 19th, 2018. Exactly 39 years after Michelle went to the mall. 39 years after her family waited for her to come home. 39 years after her car was found in that parking lot. And now, on that anniversary, investigators finally had the one thing they had never had before: a name. So they went to Jerry Burns. By then, Burns was not some drifter who had vanished after 1979. He was a man living an ordinary life in Iowa. He had worked. He had owned a business. He had neighbors. He had people around him who knew him as a regular person. And that made the discovery feel even more unsettling. Because if investigators were right, then the person connected to Michelle's case had not been hiding in the way people imagine. He had simply been living, year after year, decade after decade, while the case sat unsolved, while Michelle's parents waited, while detectives reviewed old evidence, while the mall changed, while the world changed. And all that time, the answer may have been less than 2 hours away. When investigators approached Burns, they wanted to hear his explanation, but there was a problem. He did not have one. He said he did not know Michelle. He denied being there. He could not give investigators a reason why his DNA would be connected to the evidence. And when police pressed him, the case did not become clearer in a normal way. It became stranger because, according to investigators, Burns did not react the way they expected someone to react if they were suddenly being accused of a decades-old murder they had nothing to do with. He was not emotional in the way they expected. He did not offer a detailed explanation. He did not give them a story that made sense of the DNA. Instead, when the questioning came back to the evidence, he kept pointing back to one thing: the DNA. Test the DNA. That was the idea he repeated. And in a way, that was exactly what investigators had already done. They had tested the DNA. They had followed it through a family tree. They had narrowed it to 3 brothers. They had collected the straw. They had compared the samples. And the result had brought them to him. So on December 19th, 2018, exactly 39 years after Michelle Martinko was killed, Jerry Lynn Burns was arrested. For Cedar Rapids, the arrest was shocking. For Michelle's family, it was the answer they had waited decades to hear, even though her parents were no longer alive to hear it. But an arrest is not the same thing as the end of a story, because now investigators had to do something even harder. They had to take a case from 1979, a case with old evidence, old memories, and a suspect who had lived free for nearly 40 years, and prove it in court. When Jerry Burns was arrested, the case finally had a name. But that did not mean the story was over, because in a police investigation, getting a suspect is one thing. Proving it in court is something else entirely. And this case had a problem that everyone understood right away. It was old. very old. Michelle Martinko had been killed in 1979. Burns was arrested in 2018. That meant almost 4 decades had passed between the crime and the courtroom. Witnesses had aged. Some people connected to the original investigation had died. Memories had faded. The mall had changed. The world had changed. And the defense knew exactly where to push. Because if you are defending a man in a case this old, you do not necessarily need to prove who really did it. You need to create doubt. You need to make the jury wonder whether the evidence was handled correctly. You need to make them wonder whether the DNA was as clean and certain as prosecutors said it was. You need to make them wonder whether something could have gone wrong somewhere in those 40 years. That became one of the central fights. The prosecution said the DNA was the answer. The defense said the DNA was the problem. And that is why the trial was not just about what happened in the Westdale Mall parking lot. It was also about what happened to the evidence after that night. Where was it stored? Who touched it? How was it packaged? Could it have been contaminated? Could DNA have transferred from one item to another? Could the old evidence still be trusted? Those questions mattered because for the jury, the DNA was the bridge between 1979 and Jerry Burns. Without that bridge, Burns was just a man who had been living in Iowa for decades. With that bridge, he was connected to Michelle's car. So the entire trial, in many ways, became a battle over that bridge. The prosecution began building their case by walking the jury back through the night Michelle disappeared. They brought in people connected to the original investigation. They explained what officers found. They explained how the evidence was collected and preserved. They explained how the case sat for years, not because no one cared, but because the technology needed to unlock it did not exist yet. And then they walked the jury through the breakthrough. The old evidence was tested. A male DNA profile was developed. That profile did not match anyone in the official database. So years later, investigators used genetic genealogy. That led them to a family line, then to 3 brothers, then to Jerry Burns, and finally to a discarded drinking straw. That straw mattered because it took the case out of the world of family trees and into direct comparison. It was not just Burns is related to someone in the genealogy result. It was Burns's DNA matches the DNA connected to Michelle's case. That was the prosecution's strongest point. The defense had to break it, so they attacked the evidence handling. They questioned the storage. They questioned whether different items from the scene had been kept together in ways that could create risk. They brought in an expert who talked about the possibility of secondary transfer. The idea that DNA can sometimes move from one surface to another without the person being directly involved in the crime. And for a moment, that gave the jury something to think about, because the defense did not have to give them a full alternate story. They only had to create a reasonable question. Maybe the DNA got there some other way. Maybe the evidence was not handled perfectly. Maybe after so many years, the state was asking the jury to trust too much. But the prosecution had an answer. They argued that the DNA was not just random skin cells in some meaningless place. It was connected to evidence from the crime scene. It was preserved from the night Michelle died. And Burns had no explanation for why it was there. That point kept coming back again and again. Burns said he did not know Michelle. He said he was not there. He said he had nothing to do with what happened. But he could not explain the DNA. And that is the problem with physical evidence. You can deny a memory. You can challenge a witness. You can say someone is mistaken. But DNA does not forget because it was nervous or tired or confused or trying to remember something from 40 years ago. DNA just sits there. And when the technology finally catches up, it points. Still, the jury had to be careful, because this was not a simple case with a fresh scene and a suspect arrested the next day. This was a case where the courtroom had to reach backward across decades. So the prosecution did something important. They did not only talk about the science, they talked about Burns's interview. When investigators confronted him, they wanted to know if there was any innocent reason his DNA would be tied to the evidence. Had he known Michelle? Had he ever been with her? Had he been in her car? Had there been some contact that would make sense of what the lab found? But Burns did not give them a clean explanation. He denied knowing her. He denied being there. And when the questions circled back to the DNA, his response was not a detailed story. It was more like a challenge. Test the DNA. But that was exactly what investigators had done. They had tested it. They had followed it. They had collected the straw. They had compared the profiles, and the answer had led to him. During the trial, the prosecution also had to deal with the age of the case emotionally. Michelle's parents were not there to see it. Her father had died years earlier. Her mother had died years earlier, too. They had spent the rest of their lives waiting for the name of the person who took their daughter from them, and they never got to hear it. So in that courtroom, the case was not only about justice. It was also about time. It was about whether time could erase accountability, whether a man could live an ordinary life for decades while the evidence waited quietly in a box, whether a family's loss could finally be answered after almost 40 years, and the jury had to decide what all of it meant. The defense wanted them to focus on uncertainty. The state wanted them to focus on the match. The defense said the evidence was old. The state said the evidence was preserved. The defense said there could be contamination. The state said there was no innocent explanation. And in the middle of all of that was Michelle, an 18-year-old girl who went to the mall for a coat. A girl whose final night had been turned into charts, lab reports, testimony, timelines, and legal arguments. That is one of the hardest things about a trial like this. The courtroom has to become technical. It has to be careful. It has to discuss rules, evidence, procedure, expert opinions, and probability. But underneath all of that, the story is painfully simple. Michelle went out. She did not come home. Her car was found. The person responsible left something behind, and 40 years later, that something led to Jerry Burns. The jury listened. They heard the forensic testimony. They heard the defense challenge. They heard the explanation of the genealogy work. They heard about the straw. They heard Burns could not explain why his DNA was tied to the evidence. And then the case went to them. At that point, there was nothing left for the lawyers to say. The state had built its bridge. The defense had tried to weaken it. Now, 12 people had to decide whether that bridge was strong enough to cross. For Michelle's family, this was the moment they had waited for. Not days, not months, not a few years, almost 4 decades. And after all that time, the decision came quickly. The jury found Jerry Lynn Burns guilty of first-degree murder. In that moment, a case that had been frozen since 1979 finally moved. It did not bring Michelle back. It did not give her parents the chance to hear the verdict. It did not erase the years of unanswered questions, but it did something that had once seemed impossible. It put a name on the shadow from the parking lot, and for the first time in nearly 40 years, Cedar Rapids could say the case was not just remembered, it was solved. But even then, one question remained, not for the jury, not for the judge, but for everyone who had followed the case. How does a person live almost 40 years after a night like that? How does he go to work, talk to neighbors, build a life, and grow older while the evidence of what happened waits quietly behind him? That is the part that makes this case so unsettling. Because Jerry Burns was not found hiding in another country. He was not living under a fake name. He was not some mythic criminal figure who disappeared into darkness. He was living an ordinary life. And maybe That is why the ending feels so cold. The answer was never on the other side of the world. It was in Iowa. The whole time. After the guilty verdict, the courtroom finally had the answer the city had been waiting for. Jerry Lynn Burns was the man the jury believed had attacked Michelle Martinko in the Westdale Mall parking lot in 1979. But the strange thing about justice after 40 years is that it never feels complete. It can give a name. It can give a sentence. It can give a family the official answer they were denied for decades. But it cannot give back the years. It cannot bring back the parents who waited for the phone call that never came. It cannot give Michelle the life she was supposed to live after that winter night. And that is what made the end of this case feel so heavy. Because when Burns was convicted, Michelle's parents were already gone. Her father had died years earlier. Her mother had died years earlier too. They had spent the rest of their lives waiting for someone to say, "We found him." And when that moment finally came, they were not there to hear it. That is one of the cruelest parts of a cold case. The answer can arrive too late for the people who needed it most. Still, for Michelle's extended family, for the investigators who had carried the file, and for Cedar Rapids, the verdict meant something. It meant the case was no longer just a terrible memory from 1979. It meant the shadow from the mall parking lot finally had a name. On August 7th, 2020, Jerry Burns was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And during that sentencing, the story became bigger than one man's conviction, because everyone understood the same thing. The case had not been solved by one dramatic confession. It had not been solved by a witness suddenly remembering everything. It had not been solved because Burns walked into a police station and told the truth. It had been solved because a tiny piece of evidence survived. Evidence from the night Michelle fought for her life. Evidence that investigators in 1979 could not fully use. Evidence that sat quietly while years passed over it. And then, when science finally caught up, that evidence did what no witness had been able to do. It pointed first to a DNA profile, then to a family tree, then to 3 brothers, then to a discarded straw, then to Jerry Burns. That is the part of the story that almost sounds impossible. A mall parking lot in 1979, a cold case file, a biological trace, a genealogy database, a man drinking from a straw almost 40 years later. And suddenly the whole distance between the past and the present collapsed. But Burns did not simply disappear into the prison system after the verdict. He continued to challenge the case. One of the biggest arguments centered on the straw, because from the defense perspective, that straw mattered in a different way. Investigators had collected it after Burns discarded it. They used it to compare his DNA to the evidence from Michelle's case. And Burns's legal team argued that collecting and testing that straw violated his rights. So even after the conviction, the legal fight continued. The question became less about what happened at the mall, and more about what police are allowed to collect when someone throws something away. Was the straw abandoned? Did Burns still have privacy rights in it? Could investigators use the DNA left on it? Those were not emotional questions. They were legal questions, technical questions. But they mattered because that straw was one of the final steps that connected Burns directly to the evidence. Without it, the state still had genealogy, but with it, they had the match. In 2023, the Iowa Supreme Court upheld Burns's conviction. The court affirmed the guilty verdict, and the legal challenge did not undo what the jury had decided. So the case remained solved. But solved does not mean understood. That is the difference. The court could say who was responsible. The evidence could show the connection. The jury could return the verdict. But one question remained strangely empty. Why? Why Michelle? Why that night? Why that mall? Why did a man with no clear public connection to her end up connected to the scene? Some cases end with a confession that fills in the missing middle. The person explains the motive, the moment, the decision, the panic, the cover-up. This case did not end that way. Burns maintained his innocence, and because of that, the emotional center of the story stayed partly closed. Investigators had the evidence. The jury had the verdict. But the full explanation of what Michelle experienced that night and why she became the target never came from the man convicted in her death. That is what makes this case linger, not because it is unsolved anymore, but because some parts of the truth never become words. For decades, people in Cedar Rapids had lived with the idea that the person responsible could be anyone, a stranger, a familiar face, someone passing through, someone who looked ordinary enough to vanish into the crowd. And in the end, the answer was not a monster from a dark road or a person living under a fake identity. It was a man who had gone on living in Iowa, a man who aged while the case aged, a man who built an ordinary life while Michelle's family waited for an answer. And that ordinary appearance is what makes the story so disturbing. Because most people imagine danger announcing itself. They imagine it looking wrong, acting wrong, standing out. But the person who hurt Michelle did not need to look like danger to everyone else. He only needed one moment when no one was looking closely enough. That is why the mall matters so much in this story. Westdale Mall was supposed to be the safe place, a public place, a bright place, a place full of witnesses. But safety is not only about light, it is about timing. And for Michelle, the difference between going home and never coming home may have been a few minutes in a parking lot, a few steps between the mall doors and the car, a few seconds where something ordinary turned into something that would haunt a city for 40 years. After the conviction, people could finally say Michelle's case had an ending. But for her family, the ending was not clean. It was not happy. It was only an answer. And sometimes in a cold case, that is all the justice system can give, an answer where there should have been a life. Still, there is something powerful in the fact that the case did not disappear. The evidence was kept. The file was reopened. The science improved. The investigators kept looking. And the truth, even after decades, still had a way to come forward. That is the part worth remembering, because the killer may have believed time was on his side. He may have believed that every year made the case weaker, that memories would fade, that witnesses would disappear, that investigators would retire, that the mall would change, that the city would move on. And for a long time, it probably looked that way. The case went quiet. The family waited. The file sat still. But time did not erase everything. It only made one clue wait longer. And that clue stayed there, hidden in the evidence long after the Christmas lights came down, long after the shoppers forgot that night, long after the parking lot stopped looking like a crime scene. It stayed there through the 1980s, through the 1990s, through the 2000s. Through new detectives, new technology, and a new world where a family tree could become a map to a suspect. And then, nearly 40 years later, that tiny clue finally did what everyone had been waiting for. It spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with a confession, but clearly enough. And when it did, it reached across 4 decades and pointed to a man who thought the past had stayed behind him. So when people talk about Michelle Martinko's case now, they often talk about the DNA. They talk about genealogy. They talk about the straw. They talk about the arrest on the 39th anniversary. And all of that matters. But the heart of the story is still much simpler. An 18-year-old girl went to the mall for a coat. Her family waited for her to come home. She never did. And for almost 40 years, the answer waited in a place no one could fully read yet. Inside the evidence, inside the silence, inside one small trace left behind on a winter night in 1979. The mall changed, the city changed, the world changed. But that clue stayed exactly where it was, waiting for the day someone finally knew how to listen.